The evening sun was setting over Cedar Valley as Colonel Thomas Johnson made his way home from what should have been one of the proudest moments of his life. His daughter Lisa had just graduated from nursing school, and the ceremony had been beautiful. At 45 years old, Thomas had seen many accomplishments in his 20-year military career, but watching his little girl walk across that stage in her cap and gown had filled his heart with a different kind of pride. Thomas was still wearing his dress uniform, the same one he'd worn to the ceremony. The dark blue fabric was perfectly pressed, and his chest displayed the ribbons and medals he'd earned through 2 decades of faithful service to his country. Among them was the Bronze Star he'd received for his actions in Afghanistan, where he'd saved the lives of 3 soldiers under enemy fire. The Purple Heart sat next to it, a reminder of the shrapnel wound that had nearly ended his career, but couldn't break his spirit. As he drove through the quiet suburban streets of Cedar Valley, Thomas was thinking about calling his wife to let her know he was on his way home. She'd stayed behind to help Lisa pack up her dorm room, and they were planning to celebrate later that evening with dinner at their daughter's favorite restaurant. The radio was playing softly, and Thomas was humming along to an old jazz tune. When he first noticed the police car in his rearview mirror, at first, he didn't think much of it. Police cars were common enough on these roads, and Thomas had always respected law enforcement. He'd worked alongside military police throughout his career and understood the challenges that came with keeping communities safe. But when the blue and red lights suddenly flashed behind him, Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. He glanced down at his speedometer. 28 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. He hadn't been speeding. In fact, as someone who'd spent his entire adult life following military discipline and regulations, Thomas was always careful to obey traffic laws. He checked his mirrors, put on his turn signal, and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Just as he'd been taught in driver's education nearly 30 years ago, Thomas put the car in park and rolled down his window, placing both hands clearly on the steering wheel where they could be seen. This was something he'd learned not from military training, but from conversations with other black men who'd shared their experiences with traffic stops. It was a sad reality that he'd had to teach his own son these same precautions when the boy had gotten his license. The officer who approached his car was a man in his early 30s with short blonde hair and cold blue eyes. His name tag read Matthews, and something in his expression immediately put Thomas on edge. There was a hardness there, a look that Thomas had seen before in people who'd already made up their minds about who he was before they'd even spoken to him. "License and registration," Officer Matthews said curtly, not bothering with the usual greeting or explanation for the stop. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied politely, reaching slowly for his wallet. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Matthews' jaw tightened. "You were speeding, license and registration." Now, Thomas knew he hadn't been speeding, but he also knew that arguing with a police officer on the side of the road rarely ended well. He carefully pulled out his driver's license and reached across to the glove compartment for his registration. As he did, he made sure to announce his movements clearly. "I'm just reaching for my registration in the glove compartment," he said, opening it slowly and retrieving the document. When Thomas handed over his license and registration, he also pulled out his military identification card. It was something he'd gotten in the habit of doing during traffic stops, hoping it might help establish rapport with officers who might have military backgrounds or family members in service. "Here's my license and registration, officer. I'm also active duty military," Thomas said. Holding out all 3 cards, Matthews took the documents but barely glanced at the military ID before tossing it back through the window. The small plastic card bounced off Thomas's chest and fell to the floor of the car. "I don't care about your little military card," Matthews said with obvious disdain. "You people always think that's going to get you out of trouble." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You people?" In those 2 words, Thomas heard everything he'd hoped his uniform and service record might shield him from. He felt his face grow hot, but he forced himself to remain calm. He dealt with prejudice before, unfortunately, but never while in uniform, and never from someone who was supposed to serve and protect all citizens equally. "Officer, I wasn't trying to get out of anything," Thomas said carefully. I was just identifying myself as required. I don't believe I was speeding. Could you tell me what speed you clocked me at? Matthew's expression grew even more hostile. Are you questioning me? Are you calling me a liar? Thomas felt his heart rate increase. The situation was escalating quickly and he wasn't sure why. He'd been nothing but respectful and cooperative. No, sir, I'm not calling you anything. I'm just trying to understand the situation. Step out of the car, Matthews ordered suddenly. Thomas blinked in surprise. I'm sorry, what? I said step out of the car. Are you deaf? This was not standard procedure for a simple speeding ticket, and Thomas knew it. But he also knew that refusing to comply with a police officer's orders, even unreasonable ones, could lead to much worse consequences. He reached for his seatbelt, moving slowly and deliberately. I'm unbuckling my seatbelt now, he announced, then opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. Standing next to his car in his dress uniform, Thomas cut an impressive figure. At 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a straight military bearing, he looked every inch the decorated officer he was. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his expression calm despite the growing tension of the situation. But Matthews seemed to see something entirely different. His hand moved to rest on his service weapon, and his voice took on an even more aggressive tone. Turn around and put your hands on the car, he ordered. Thomas's military training kicked in. When given an order, even an unreasonable one, sometimes compliance was the safest option until the situation could be sorted out later through proper channels. He turned around and placed his hands flat on the roof of his car, feeling the cool metal through his white dress gloves. Officer, I'm complying with your instructions, Thomas said over his shoulder. But I'd like to understand what I'm being detained for. I wasn't speeding, and I've been completely cooperative. You're being detained because I say you're being detained, Matthews replied, moving closer behind Thomas. Maybe if you people learned some respect for authority, you wouldn't find yourselves in these situations. There it was again, you people. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his daughter's graduation, of the pride he'd felt just an hour ago, of the 20 years he'd spent serving a country that sometimes seemed determined to remind him that his service didn't matter as much as the color of his skin. Other cars were starting to slow down as they passed, their drivers rubbernecking to see what was happening. Thomas could only hope that someone might be recording, that there would be some record of what was about to unfold. Because despite his best efforts to remain calm and cooperative, despite his uniform and his service record and his decades of following every rule and regulation, Thomas Johnson was beginning to realize that this traffic stop was about to become something much worse. Standing there with his hands on the car, Colonel Thomas Johnson tried to process what was happening. The evening air was cool against his face, and he could hear the distant sounds of suburban life continuing around him. Kids playing in nearby yards, the hum of air conditioners, dogs barking. Life was going on normally for everyone else, but for Thomas, this moment felt like it was stretching into eternity. Officer Matthews moved around to face him, his boots scraping against the asphalt. Thomas could see the man's reflection in his car window, and what he saw there troubled him deeply. This wasn't the look of a professional law enforcement officer doing his job. This was something else entirely, something personal and ugly. So tell me, Matthews said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, what kind of games are you people playing these days? Dressing up in costumes, pretending to be soldiers? Thomas felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The word costume hit him like a slap. This wasn't a costume. It was a uniform he'd earned the right to wear through years of sacrifice, training, and service. He'd bled for the right to wear these ribbons, had friends who died wearing this same uniform. Officer, this is my dress uniform, Thomas said, keeping his voice as steady as possible. I'm an active duty colonel in the United States Army. I just came from my daughter's graduation ceremony. Matthews laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right, and I'm supposed to believe that, am I? You expect me to think the Army would make someone like you a colonel? The word stung more than Thomas wanted to admit. He'd heard variations of this his entire military career, the assumption that he couldn't have earned his rank on merit, that somehow his achievements were less valid because of his race. It never got easier to hear, but he'd learned to channel that pain into determination to prove himself over and over again. "Sir, you can verify my credentials through military channels if you'd like," Thomas offered. "My commanding officer is General Patricia Hayes at Fort Davidson. You're welcome to contact the base," but Matthews wasn't interested in verification. He seemed more interested in humiliation. "Oh, so now you're name-dropping generals? What's next, you gonna tell me you know the president personally?" Thomas closed his eyes briefly, thinking of his wife and daughter. They were probably wondering where he was by now. Lisa had wanted to call him after they finished packing her dorm room, and his wife would be worried if he didn't answer his phone soon. He imagined trying to explain this encounter to them later, and his heart sank. "I'm not name-dropping anyone," Thomas said quietly. "I'm just trying to cooperate with you and resolve whatever issue you have with me." "Issue?" Matthews stepped closer, and Thomas could smell the coffee on his breath. "My issue is that I'm tired of people like you thinking you're better than everyone else. Walking around in your fancy uniforms, acting like you own the place." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Here he was, being accused of thinking he was better than everyone else, while bent over a car being treated like a criminal for no reason whatsoever. He'd spent his entire adult life serving others, protecting the very freedoms that this officer was now violating. "Officer Matthews," Thomas said, reading the name tag again. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I took an oath to serve and protect this country, just like you took an oath to serve and protect this community. We're both public servants." "You dare compare yourself to me," Matthews snapped. "I don't need some diversity hire telling me about oaths." There it was, the assumption that Thomas hadn't earned his position, that he was only where he was because of his race rather than despite the obstacles his race had created. It was an assumption that ignored the extra hurdles he'd had to jump, the additional scrutiny he'd faced, the times he'd had to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Matthews walked back to his patrol car, but instead of running Thomas's license and writing a ticket like any normal traffic stop, he got on his radio. Thomas could hear fragments of the conversation, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "Yeah, I need backup at Cedar and Oak," Matthews was saying. "I've got a suspicious individual here claiming to be military, acting aggressive and uncooperative." Thomas's head snapped up. Aggressive? Uncooperative? He'd done everything Matthews had asked, answered every question politely, and maintained perfect composure despite the increasingly hostile treatment. But somehow, in Matthews's version of events, Thomas was the problem. The backup request worried Thomas for several reasons. First, it meant this encounter was about to get much more complicated, with more officers arriving who would only hear Matthews's version of events. Second, it suggested that Matthews was planning to escalate this far beyond what any reasonable traffic stop should involve. And third, Thomas knew that when multiple officers responded to a call about an aggressive black man, things could go very wrong very quickly. Cars continued to pass by. And Thomas noticed that several drivers were slowing down to look. A few had even pulled over and were watching from a distance. In the age of smartphones and social media, Thomas hoped that someone might be recording this encounter. It might be the only protection he had against whatever Matthews was planning to do next. "Officer," Thomas called out, "I'd like to exercise my right to contact my attorney." Matthews slammed his radio back into its holder and stormed back over. T.O. Thomas, "Attorney? Now you want an attorney? For what, a traffic stop?" "You called for backup and described me as aggressive and uncooperative," Thomas replied calmly. "That suggests this is no longer a simple traffic stop. I have the right to legal representation." "You have the right to shut up and do what I tell you," Matthews shot back. "And right now, I'm telling you to keep your hands on that car and your mouth shut." Thomas could hear sirens in the distance now, growing closer. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear of doing anything wrong. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, but from the knowledge that situations like this had a tendency to spiral out of control quickly. He thought about all the news stories he'd seen, all the families who'd lost loved ones during routine encounters with police that had escalated unnecessarily. He thought about his son, David, who was away at college studying engineering. David was smart and ambitious, with dreams of designing bridges and buildings that would stand for generations. But David was also a young black man, and Thomas had spent years teaching him how to navigate encounters with law enforcement safely. Now, here was Thomas himself, following all the rules he'd taught his son, and it wasn't working. "You know what I think?" Matthews continued, walking in a circle around Thomas like a predator stalking prey. "I think you bought this uniform at some surplus store. I think you're one of those stolen valor cases, pretending to be something you're not, to impress people." The accusation hit Thomas harder than any physical blow could have. Stolen valor, the act of falsely claiming military service or honors, was something that genuine veterans found particularly offensive. Thomas had earned every ribbon on his chest through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had led men and women into combat, had made life-and-death decisions that still kept him awake some nights. "Officer, I can provide documentation of my service record," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "I can give you contact information for my unit, my commanding officer, anyone you'd like to speak with." But Matthews wasn't interested in facts. He seemed determined to create his own narrative, one that painted Thomas as the villain in this encounter despite all evidence to the contrary. The sirens were getting closer now, and Thomas could see flashing lights approaching in his peripheral vision. Whatever was about to happen next, he knew it was going to change his life forever. He just hoped he'd live through it to tell his family about it later. The backup patrol cars arrived like a small convoy, their red and blue lights painting the quiet suburban street in an eerie glow. Thomas could see curious neighbors beginning to peek out from behind curtains and gather on their front porches. Children who had been playing in yards were being called inside by worried parents. What had started as a simple evening drive home was turning into a neighborhood spectacle. 3 additional officers stepped out of their vehicles, and Thomas felt a small surge of hope. Maybe these officers would be more professional than Matthews. Maybe they'd ask questions, review the situation, and realize that this whole encounter had gotten out of hand. Maybe common sense would prevail, but as the officers approached, Thomas could see Matthews already talking to them in hushed tones, pointing in his direction and making gestures that suggested conflict and danger. Thomas couldn't hear the exact words, but he could read body language well enough to know that Matthews was painting him as the aggressor in this situation. Officer Reynolds, the oldest of the backup officers, approached Thomas first. He was a man in his 50s with gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd been in law enforcement for decades. Thomas hoped that experience might mean wisdom and restraint. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where we can see them," Reynolds said, his voice more professional than Matthews but still tense. "Yes, sir, my hands have been on my car the entire time," Thomas replied, not moving from his position. "Officer, I'm a colonel in the United States Army. I was pulled over for allegedly speeding, though I wasn't speeding, and this situation has escalated far beyond what seems necessary for a traffic violation." Reynolds glanced back at Matthews, who was standing near his patrol car with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. "Officer Matthews says you've been uncooperative and aggressive." Thomas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, I've complied with every instruction given to me. I've been respectful and cooperative throughout this entire encounter. I haven't raised my voice, made any threatening gestures, or done anything that could reasonably be considered aggressive." "He's lying," Matthews called out from behind the other officers. "He's been hostile from the moment I pulled him over. Started playing the race card, claiming to be some kind of war hero." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He wasn't playing any cards. He was simply existing as a black man in America, wearing a uniform he'd earned through years of service. And he wasn't claiming to be a war hero. He was just trying to identify himself properly as required by law. "Officers," Thomas said, his voice still calm but with an edge of frustration creeping in, You can verify my identity and service record through military channels. My commanding officer is General Hayes at Fort Davidson. My unit can confirm my status and location today. But even as he spoke, Thomas could see that the officers had already made up their minds. They were going to trust Matthews's word over his, regardless of evidence or logic. It was a reality that Thomas had hoped his uniform might shield him from, but he was learning that some prejudices run deeper than respect for military service. "Turn around slowly," Reynolds ordered. "We need to search you." "Search me for what?" Thomas asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "I was allegedly speeding." "That's a traffic violation, not a felony? What legal justification do you have for searching me?" "You're being detained for investigation," Matthews interjected, walking closer to the group. "We have reasonable suspicion that you might be impersonating a military officer." The accusation was so absurd that Thomas almost laughed. Here he was, wearing a perfectly fitted dress uniform with properly earned ribbons and medals, speaking with the bearing and vocabulary of an educated officer, and they were suggesting he was an imposter. It would have been comical if it weren't so dangerous. "This is my uniform," Thomas said, his patience finally beginning to wear thin. "These are my ribbons, earned through 20 years of faithful service to this country. I have identification in my wallet, and I've offered multiple ways for you to verify my identity through official channels." But reasoning with them seemed pointless. Thomas could see that this wasn't about facts or evidence, it was about power and control, about putting him in his place regardless of his rank or service record. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered across the street now, many of them holding cell phones. Thomas hoped they were recording. In an age where everything was documented, he prayed that someone was capturing this encounter so that there would be evidence of what really happened here tonight. Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from where they were stopped, had come out to her mailbox and was watching with obvious concern. She'd seen Thomas drive through this neighborhood countless times over the years, always waving politely, always driving carefully. She knew he lived nearby with his family, knew he was military. Her expression showed that she understood something very wrong was happening. "Ma'am, please go back inside," one of the backup officers called to her. "This is police business." But Mrs. Chin didn't move. She stood there with her phone held up, recording everything. Thomas felt a small surge of gratitude toward this brave woman who was willing to be a witness when others might have looked away. "Officer Reynolds," Thomas tried once more, "I'm asking you as one public servant to another, what crime do you believe I've committed that justifies this level of response?" "I wasn't speeding, I've been completely cooperative, and I've committed no violation of law." Reynolds looked uncomfortable for a moment, and Thomas thought he might be getting through to him. But then Matthews stepped forward, his hand moving to his taser. "That's enough talking," Matthews said, his voice filled with authority that seemed to override Reynolds' hesitation. "You've been argumentative and uncooperative since the moment I pulled you over. Now you're going to comply with our orders, or face the consequences." Thomas felt his heart rate spike. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of enemy combatants who'd made the decision to fight rather than surrender. Matthews had moved beyond law enforcement into something much more dangerous. "I am complying," Thomas said, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the fear that was building in his chest. "I've complied with every lawful order you've given me." "Lawful order?" Matthews laughed harshly. "I'll tell you what's lawful and what isn't. Right now, I'm ordering you to get on the ground." Thomas knew that getting on the ground would put him in an even more vulnerable position, but he also knew that refusing could be used as justification for whatever Matthews was planning to do next. He began to slowly lower himself toward the pavement, moving carefully and deliberately to avoid any action that could be misinterpreted as threatening. But as he began to kneel, Matthews suddenly shouted, "He's reaching for something!" Thomas's blood ran cold. He wasn't reaching for anything. His hands were clearly visible, moving slowly as he lowered himself to the ground. But he knew that Matthews's words were being spoken for the benefit of the other officers and any recording devices that might be present. I'm not reaching for anything, Thomas said loudly, making sure his voice would be picked up by any cameras. My hands are visible. I'm complying with orders. But it was too late. Matthews had already drawn his taser, and Thomas could see the determination in his eyes. This had been the plan all along, to create a situation where force would seem justified. Where a decorated veteran could be brutalized with impunity. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas saw Matthews's finger move toward the trigger. He thought of his daughter's graduation earlier that day, of his wife waiting at home, of his son studying, late in his college dorm room. He thought of all the soldiers he'd served with, the ones who'd made it home and the ones who hadn't, and how they'd never imagined that one of their own would face this kind of treatment on American soil while wearing the uniform they'd all sworn to honor. The taser fired with a sharp crackling sound, and 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through Thomas's body. He collapsed to the pavement, his muscles convulsing uncontrollably, his perfectly pressed uniform now torn and dirty. The medals and ribbons he'd earned through blood and sacrifice scattered across the asphalt, like discarded trash. As consciousness faded, Thomas could hear Mrs. Chun screaming, could see the shocked faces of neighbors, could feel the weight of injustice pressing down on him like a physical force. And in that moment, as he lay helpless on the ground, Colonel Thomas Johnson realized that his real battle was just beginning. The call came into Fort Davidson at exactly 9:47 p.m., just as General Patricia Hayes was finishing up some paperwork in her office. She'd been planning to head home soon to have a late dinner with her husband, but something in the voice of the person on the other end of the line made her forget all about her evening plans. General Hayes, this is Rebecca Johnson. I'm sorry to call you so late, but something terrible has happened to my husband Thomas. General Hayes immediately recognized the name. Colonel Thomas Johnson was one of her most reliable officers, a man she'd worked with for over 8 years. He was the kind of soldier who never missed a deadline, never gave her cause for concern, and always went above and beyond what was expected of him. The idea that something terrible had happened to him sent a chill down her spine. Mrs. Johnson, slow down and tell me what's happened, the general said. Grabbing a pen and notepad from her desk, Rebecca's voice was shaking as she explained what little she knew. Thomas had been driving home from their daughter's graduation ceremony when he'd been pulled over by police. Hours had passed, and she'd received a call from the hospital saying that her husband had been brought in after being tased by officers. He was conscious now but shaken, and the doctors were keeping him for observation. He was in his dress uniform. General, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. He was so proud today, watching Lisa graduate, and now he's in a hospital bed because some police officer decided he was a threat. General Hayes felt her jaw clench. She'd served in combat zones around the world, had commanded troops in some of the most dangerous places on earth, but the idea that one of her officers had been assaulted while in uniform on American soil filled her with a rage she rarely allowed herself to feel. Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that we're going to handle this situation, the general said, her voice taking on the tone of command that had carried her through 30 years of military service. I'm heading to the hospital now to check on Thomas, and I'm activating our legal affairs team immediately. After hanging up with Rebecca, General Hayes immediately called Colonel Robert Martinez, the base's top legal officer. Martinez had been asleep, but he was wide awake by the time the general finished explaining the situation. General, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just a civil rights violation, Martinez said, his legal mind already working through the implications. This is an assault on a federal officer in uniform. That puts it in a completely different category legally. I want every detail of this incident documented, General Hayes ordered. Contact the FBI field office, the Military Police Command, and the Inspector General's office. I want a full investigation launched immediately. Yes, ma'am. I'll also reach out to our contacts in the Justice Department. An unprovoked attack on a uniformed service member is something they take very seriously. General Hayes was already grabbing her keys and heading for the door. I'm going to the hospital first to check on Thomas and get his account of what happened. Then I want a meeting with our entire command staff first thing in the morning. The drive to Cedar Valley General Hospital gave the general time to think. And the more she thought about the situation, the angrier she became. Thomas Johnson wasn't just any soldier, he was a decorated combat veteran who'd served his country with distinction for 2 decades. He'd led troops in battle, saved lives under fire, and earned the respect of everyone who'd served with him. At the hospital, General Hayes found Thomas sitting up in bed, still wearing the torn remnants of his dress uniform. His wife, Rebecca, was beside him, holding his hand, while their daughter Lisa sat in a chair nearby, her eyes red from crying. The sight of this proud military family brought low by such an senseless act of violence made the general's resolve even stronger. "Thomas," she said, approaching the bed, "how are you feeling?" "I've been better, General," Thomas replied, managing a weak smile. "But I'm alive, and that's more than I was sure about for a while there." Thomas recounted the entire incident in detail, from the initial traffic stop to the moment the taser dropped him to the pavement. General Hayes listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. With each detail, her determination to see justice done grew stronger. "The worst part," Thomas said, his voice heavy with emotion, "was hearing that officer tell the others that I was aggressive and uncooperative. I followed every rule, General. I did everything by the book, just like we train our soldiers to do, and it didn't matter." "It matters to me," General Hayes said firmly. "And it's going to matter to a lot of other people before this is over." While they were talking, Colonel Martinez called with an update. The FBI had already opened a preliminary investigation based on the general's request. The local police department had been contacted and told to preserve all evidence, including body camera footage and patrol car recordings. And most importantly, the incident had been reported to the Pentagon through official channels. "General," Martinez said over the phone, "this is moving up the chain of command faster than I've ever seen. The Secretary of the Army's office has already been briefed, and they're requesting a full report by tomorrow morning." General Hayes felt a grim satisfaction. When the military moved with this kind of speed and determination, it usually meant that someone was about to face serious consequences for their actions. Back at the base, word of the incident was spreading quickly through unofficial channels. Soldiers talked, and news like this traveled fast. By midnight, practically everyone on Fort Davidson knew that one of their own had been attacked while in uniform. The reaction was swift and unanimous. Outrage. Master Sergeant Williams, who'd served under Thomas in Afghanistan, was among the first to volunteer for whatever action the command might take. "Colonel Johnson saved my life overseas," he told anyone who would listen. "If someone thinks they can treat him like this and get away with it, they've got another thing coming." The sentiment was echoed throughout the base. Thomas Johnson wasn't just popular with his fellow officers, he was respected by enlisted personnel at every level. He was known for taking care of his people, for fighting for their benefits and recognition, for always having an open door when someone needed help or advice. Captain Jennifer Lee, one of the younger officers who'd served under Thomas, summed up the feelings of many when she said, "If they can do this to Colonel Johnson, they can do it to any of us." This isn't just about one incident. This is about whether our uniform means anything when we're not on base. The legal implications were becoming clearer as well. Under federal law, attacking a uniformed military officer could be prosecuted as an assault on a federal official. The fact that Thomas had been in his dress uniform at the time, clearly identifiable as military personnel, made the officer's actions even more serious from a legal standpoint. General Hayes spent most of the night making phone calls and coordinating the military's response. By dawn, she'd spoken with officials at the Pentagon, the FBI, the Justice Department, and half a dozen other agencies. Everyone she talked to had the same reaction. This kind of attack on military personnel couldn't be tolerated. The general also made sure that Thomas and his family had everything they needed. The base's family support services were activated to help with anything from meals to legal assistance. The message was clear: the military takes care of its own, and when one of their people is attacked, the entire institution responds. As the sun rose over Fort Davidson, General Hayes stood in her office, looking out at the base where she'd served for so many years. In a few hours, she'd be meeting with her command staff to plan their next moves. But she already knew what those moves would be. The military was going to make sure that justice was done, not just for Thomas Johnson, but for every service member who might face similar treatment in the future. The attack on Colonel Johnson had awakened something powerful, the protective instincts of an institution that had spent centuries defending its people and its principles. And Officer Matthews was about to learn that when you attack one member of the military family, you attack them all. The sun was barely up when FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh arrived at Fort Davidson. She'd been called out of bed at 5 a.m. by her supervisor, who'd made it clear that this case was already drawing attention from the highest levels of government. An unprovoked attack on a uniformed military officer wasn't just a local police matter. It was a federal crime that could have serious implications for military-civilian relations. Agent Walsh had been investigating civil rights violations for over 15 years, but something about this case felt different from the moment she read the initial report. The victim wasn't just any citizen, he was a decorated colonel with a spotless service record, attacked while wearing his dress uniform after his daughter's graduation. The symbolism alone was enough to make this case a powder keg dot at the bases. Legal Affairs Office, she met with Colonel Martinez and General Hayes, who had assembled a comprehensive file on the incident in just a few hours. The speed and thoroughness of their response impressed Walsh, but it also told her how seriously the military was taking this situation. "Agent Walsh," General Hayes said, sliding a thick folder across the conference table, "this is everything we've compiled so far. Colonel Johnson's complete service record, witness statements from the scene, and our preliminary analysis of the legal issues involved." Walsh opened the folder and immediately understood why the military was so outraged. Thomas Johnson's record read like a textbook example of military excellence. 2 combat tours, multiple commendations for bravery, perfect efficiency reports, and glowing recommendations from every superior he'd ever served under. This wasn't some troublemaker or marginal soldier, this was one of the Army's best. Has Colonel Johnson ever had any issues with civilian law enforcement before? Walsh asked, already knowing what the answer would be. "Never," Colonel Martinez replied firmly. "In 20 years of service, he's never had so much as a speeding ticket. He's taught classes on community relations and has worked with local police departments on joint training exercises. He's exactly the kind of officer we hold up as an example of military professionalism." Meanwhile, back at the Cedar Valley Police Department, Chief Robert Harrison was having the worst morning of his career. He'd arrived at the station to find 3 federal agents waiting for him, along with orders to preserve all evidence related to Officer Matthews's traffic stop the night before. The FBI wanted everything: body camera footage, patrol car recordings, radio transmissions, and Matthews's complete personnel file. Chief Harrison had been hoping to handle this situation quietly, maybe with some internal discipline and a settlement with the Johnson family. But as he watched federal agents methodically going through his department's records, he realized that this incident was spiraling far beyond his control. The first piece of evidence that caught Agent Walsh's attention was the body camera footage from Officer Matthews. What she saw on that recording made her stomach turn. There was Thomas Johnson, clearly identifiable in his military dress uniform, being polite and cooperative throughout the entire encounter. And there was Matthews, escalating the situation at every turn, making inflammatory comments, and ultimately using his taser without any justification whatsoever. "This is one of the clearest cases of excessive force I've seen in years," Walsh told her supervisor over the phone. The victim did absolutely nothing to justify the officer's actions. He was the model of cooperation and respect. But the body camera footage was just the beginning. As federal investigators dug deeper into Matthews's background, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that the Cedar Valley Police Department had either ignored or actively covered up. Detective Ray Thompson, who'd worked with Matthews for 3 years, reluctantly admitted under questioning that his colleague had a reputation for being tough on certain types of people. When pressed for details, Thompson revealed that Matthews had used excessive force at least 6 times in the past 2 years, always against Black or Hispanic suspects and always in situations where his actions were later deemed unnecessary by review boards. But Chief Harrison always backed him up, Thompson explained to federal investigators. He said Matthews was just being thorough, doing his job the way it needed to be done in tough neighborhoods. The pattern was even more disturbing when investigators examined the complaints that had been filed against Matthews. Over the past 5 years, 17 different citizens had filed formal complaints alleging racial profiling, excessive force, or unprofessional conduct. All 17 complaints had been dismissed as unfounded by Internal Affairs, often without any real investigation. Mrs. Chun, the elderly neighbor who had recorded the incident, became a crucial witness when FBI agents interviewed her the next morning. Her cell phone video provided a clear view of the entire encounter from a different angle than the police body cameras, and her testimony was damning. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she told Agent Walsh. "I know Colonel Johnson and his family. They're good people, respectful people. What that police officer did was wrong, and everybody who saw it knows it was wrong." Mrs. Chen's video had already been shared with several civil rights organizations, and by noon it was beginning to spread on social media. The footage showed Thomas in his dress uniform, clearly complying with all orders, being tased for no apparent reason. The visual impact was devastating, a decorated veteran being brutalized, while wearing the uniform he'd earned through years of faithful service. At the NAACP's regional office, Director Michael Washington was fielding calls from reporters and activists who had seen the video. The organization had dealt with police brutality cases before, but the attack on a uniformed military officer added a new dimension to the situation. "This isn't just about racial profiling anymore," Washington explained to his staff during an emergency meeting. "This is about respect for military service, respect for the uniform, and respect for the sacrifices our veterans have made." This case has the potential to unite communities that don't always see eye to eye. The military veterans community was indeed rallying around Thomas in ways that surprised even seasoned civil rights advocates. The veterans of foreign wars, the American Legion, and Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America all issued statements condemning the attack and demanding justice. Social media groups for military families were sharing the story widely, and the anger was building across all racial and political lines. Captain Jennifer Lee, who had served under Thomas in his previous assignment, was among the many military personnel who reached out to offer support. "Colonel Johnson taught me everything I know about leadership," she said when interviewed by investigators. "He's the kind of officer who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. The idea that someone would treat him this way is just incomprehensible." The legal case against Matthews was becoming stronger by the hour. Federal prosecutors were already discussing charges that could include deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime that carried serious prison time. The fact that Thomas was a federal officer in uniform made the charges even more severe under federal sentencing guidelines, but the investigation was revealing problems that went far beyond one bad officer. Chief Harrison's department had a documented history of dismissing complaints against Matthews, suggesting a systemic problem with accountability and oversight. Internal emails obtained by federal investigators showed that some supervisors had privately expressed concerns about Matthews's conduct, but those concerns had never resulted in any meaningful disciplinary action. Agent Walsh was building a case that could potentially bring down not just Matthews, but several other officers and supervisors who had enabled his behavior over the years. The pattern of complaints, the lack of proper investigation, and the culture of protection around problem officers all pointed to institutional failures that federal prosecutors could address under civil rights law. As word of the investigation spread, other victims of Matthews's behavior began coming forward. 3 different families contacted the FBI to report incidents where Matthews had used excessive force or engaged in clear racial profiling, but their complaints had been dismissed by the department's Internal Affairs Division. By evening, the Scope of the investigation had expanded far beyond the attack on Thomas Johnson. Federal investigators were now looking at the entire Cedar Valley Police Department, examining patterns of misconduct and the systematic failure to hold officers accountable. What had started as one incident was becoming a comprehensive examination of police, culture, and civilian oversight. For Thomas and his family, the growing investigation was both encouraging and overwhelming. They were grateful for the support they were receiving from the military community and civil rights organizations, but the media attention was intense and sometimes invasive. Rebecca Johnson found herself fielding calls from reporters around the clock, while their daughter Lisa struggled to focus on her new job search amid the chaos surrounding her family. The investigation was just beginning, but already it was clear that this case would have implications far beyond Cedar Valley. The attack on Colonel Thomas Johnson had exposed problems that existed in police departments across the country. At exactly 0800 hours on Friday morning, General Hayes made a decision that would make military history. Standing in her office at Fort Davidson, surrounded by her senior staff and legal advisors, she authorized something that hadn't been done in decades: a direct military police intervention in a civilian law enforcement matter involving one of their own. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general announced to her assembled officers, "one of our decorated veterans was assaulted while wearing the uniform of the United States Army. The local authorities have failed to take appropriate action, and the FBI investigation, while thorough, will take months to complete. I'm not willing to wait that long for justice." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Rodriguez, commander of the base's military police battalion, stepped forward. She was a career MP with 15 years of experience, known for her by-the-book approach and unwavering dedication to military law. "General, what exactly are you authorizing?" "I'm authorizing a full MP investigation under the Military Cooperation with Civilian Authorities Act," General Hayes replied. "Colonel Johnson was attacked while serving as a federal officer in uniform. That gives us jurisdiction to investigate this matter independently and to demand full cooperation from local law enforcement." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What the general was proposing was legal, but it was also unprecedented in its scope and boldness. Military police rarely intervened directly in civilian matters, but the attack on Thomas Johnson had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Colonel Rodriguez understood the gravity of the situation immediately. "How many personnel are you authorizing?" "For this operation, General?" "Whatever you need," Hayes replied firmly. "I want a show of force that makes it clear we take attacks on our personnel seriously. I want the civilian authorities to understand that when you assault a member of the United States military, there will be consequences." Within 2 hours, Rodriguez had assembled a team of 30 military police officers, along with investigators from the Criminal Investigation Division and legal specialists from the Judge Advocate General's office. The convoy that formed up at Fort Davidson looked more like a military operation than a police investigation, which was exactly what General Hayes intended. The sight of military Humvees and personnel carriers rolling through the quiet streets of Cedar Valley was something residents had never seen before. People came out of their houses and businesses to watch the convoy pass, many pulling out their phones to record the unprecedented scene. Word spread quickly through social media that the military was responding to the attack on Colonel Johnson in a way no one had expected. At the Cedar Valley Police Department, Sergeant Janet Williams was working the front desk when she looked up to see military vehicles surrounding the building. Her first thought was that there must be some kind of emergency or terrorist threat, but as she watched uniformed military police officers exit their vehicles in formation, she realized something much more significant was happening. "Lieutenant." Colonel Rodriguez approached the front desk with 2 MPs flanking her, carrying official documentation. Her bearing was crisp and professional, but there was an unmistakable sense of authority in her voice when she spoke. "Sergeant Williams, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, commanding officer of the Fort Davidson Military Police Battalion. I'm here to conduct an official investigation into the assault of Colonel Thomas Johnson, a federal officer acting in his official capacity. I need to speak with your commanding officer immediately." Sergeant Williams had been with the Cedar Valley Police Department for 12 years, but she'd never encountered anything like this. The military officer standing before her wasn't asking for cooperation. She was demanding it with the full authority of the federal government behind her. "Ma'am, I'll need to call Chief Harrison," Williams stammered, reaching for her phone. "Chief Harrison has been expecting us," Rodriguez replied calmly. "The FBI notified him yesterday that military investigators would be arriving to conduct our own independent investigation. We're here under federal authority, and we require immediate access to all personnel and records related to this incident." In his office, Chief Harrison was pacing nervously when his secretary informed him that the military police had arrived. He'd hoped the phone call from the FBI the day before had been some kind of misunderstanding, but as he looked out his window at the military vehicles surrounding his building, he realized that his department was facing a crisis unlike anything in its history. When Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez entered his office, Chief Harrison tried to assert his authority as the senior law enforcement official in the jurisdiction. "Colonel, I appreciate your concern for your officer, but this is a civilian matter that my department is fully capable of handling through our normal procedures." Rodriguez's response was swift and uncompromising. Chief Harrison, Colonel Johnson, was assaulted while wearing the uniform of the United States Army, making him a federal officer acting in his official capacity. Under federal law, this gives us independent jurisdiction to investigate and take appropriate action. Your cooperation is not optional, it's required. She placed a thick folder on Harrison's desk. These are federal court orders requiring your department to provide complete access to all personnel records, evidence, and facilities related to this investigation. Any attempt to obstruct or interfere with our investigation will result in federal charges being filed against you personally. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in for Harrison. This wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. His entire department was under federal scrutiny, and the military wasn't playing by the usual rules of civilian law enforcement politics outside the police station. The scene was unlike anything Cedar Valley had ever witnessed. Military police officers had established a perimeter around the building, with checkpoints controlling access to the property. Local officers arriving for their shifts found themselves being questioned by MPs and required to provide identification. Before entering their own workplace, Officer Reynolds, who had been present during the incident with Thomas Johnson, arrived for his afternoon shift to find two military investigators waiting to interview him. The professional but intimidating presence of the MPs made it clear that this wasn't going to be the kind of informal internal review he'd experienced in the past. "Officer Reynolds," said Major David Chun from the Criminal Investigation Division, "we need to discuss your involvement in the incident involving Colonel Johnson 2 nights ago. I want to remind you that making false statements to federal investigators is a felony that carries serious prison time." Reynolds felt sweat beading on his forehead as he realized the gravity of his situation. He'd gone along with Matthews's version of events in his incident report, but now he was facing federal investigators who clearly knew the truth about what had happened that night. The media attention was intense and immediate. News vans from local and national outlets began arriving within hours of the military convoy's appearance. The sight of the U.S. military essentially taking over a civilian police department was unprecedented, and reporters were scrambling to understand the legal and political implications. Rebecca Johnson watched the coverage from her living room, feeling a mixture of pride and anxiety. She was proud that the military was standing up for her husband in such a dramatic way, but she was also worried about the attention this was bringing to their family. Their phone had been ringing constantly with interview requests, and reporters had been showing up at their house at all hours. "Thomas," she said to her husband, who was still recovering from his injuries, "I never imagined it would become this big." Thomas, watching the news coverage of military vehicles surrounding the police station, shook his head in amazement. "Neither did I, but maybe that's what it takes to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." At Fort Davidson, General Hayes was fielding calls from Pentagon officials, who were both supportive and concerned about the unprecedented nature of the military's response. The Secretary of the Army had personally called to express his support. for protecting military personnel, but he'd also cautioned about the potential political ramifications of such a dramatic intervention. "General," the secretary had said, "I support what you're doing, but you understand that this is going to draw attention from Congress and the media. Make sure your people do everything by the book." "Yes, sir," General Hayes had replied. "But I'd rather deal with political attention than explain to another military family why we didn't do everything in our power to protect one of our own." Back at the police station, the investigation was proceeding with military efficiency. MPs were interviewing every officer who had been on duty the night of the incident, while SID investigators were going through Matthews's personnel file and past incident reports with a fine-tooth comb. The atmosphere in the building was tense, with civilian officers unsure of their rights and authority in the face of federal military investigators. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez established a command post in the police station's conference room, turning it into a military investigation center complete with secure communications equipment and evidence processing facilities. The message was clear. By noon on Friday, the tension inside the Cedar Valley Police Department had reached a breaking point. Chief Harrison sat in his office, watching through his window as military police officers continued their methodical investigation of his department. Every few minutes, another one of his officers was called in for questioning by federal investigators, and none of them were coming out looking confident about their futures. The breaking point came when Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez requested access to the department's internal affairs files going back 5 years. This wasn't just about the incident with Colonel Johnson anymore. The military investigators were conducting a comprehensive review of how the department handled complaints and disciplinary actions. "Absolutely not," Chief Harrison declared when Rodriguez made the request. "Those files contain confidential personnel information and ongoing investigations. I don't care what authority you think you have, I'm not turning over files that could compromise other cases." Rodriguez remained calm, but her voice carried the weight of federal authority. "Chief Harrison, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you that federal marshals will be here within the hour with a court order requiring you to turn over all requested documents. Your choice is whether to comply voluntarily or face obstruction of justice charges." Harrison felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd never been spoken to like this by anyone, let alone someone from outside his jurisdiction. "You can't just come into my department and take over like you own the place." "Chief, we're not taking over," Rodriguez replied evenly. "We're conducting a federal investigation into the assault of a uniformed military officer. Your officer attacked one of our people while he was wearing the uniform of the United States Army. That makes this a federal matter, and it gives us the authority we're exercising." Major Chun, who had been quietly documenting everything, stepped forward with a tablet in his hand. "Chief Harrison, I think you need to understand the scope of what we've discovered so far. In the past 3 hours, we've interviewed 12 officers about the incident involving Colonel Johnson. 7 of them have admitted that Officer Matthews has a pattern of using excessive force, particularly against minority citizens. 3 of them told us they've witnessed incidents where Matthews used racial slurs during arrests." Harrison's stomach dropped. He'd suspected that Matthews had issues with racial bias, but he'd always chosen to look the other way as long as there were no major complaints that couldn't be dismissed. Now federal investigators were uncovering everything he'd worked to keep buried. "Furthermore," Major Chun continued, "we've discovered that your Internal Affairs Department has dismissed 17 complaints against Matthews over the past 5 years without conducting proper investigations. In at least 6 cases, there was video evidence that contradicted Matthews's reports, but those videos were never reviewed by supervisors." The weight of decades of poor decisions was crashing down on Chief Harrison. He'd built his career on maintaining order and avoiding controversy, but now he was facing the possibility that his entire department could be placed under federal oversight. Outside the police station, the scene was growing more dramatic by the hour. News crews from major networks had arrived, broadcasting live updates about the unprecedented military takeover of a civilian police department. The story was spreading across social media, With hashtags like hashtag justice for Colonel and hashtag military takeover trending nationally. Mrs. Chun, the neighbor who had recorded the original incident, had become something of a local celebrity as reporters sought her out for interviews. Standing in front of her house, surrounded by cameras and microphones, she spoke with the simple dignity that had made her such a compelling witness. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she told the assembled reporters. "I've seen Colonel Johnson drive past my house hundreds of times. He always waves, always drives carefully, always shows respect to everyone he meets. What that police officer did to him was wrong, and I'm glad someone is finally holding them accountable." The federal marshals arrived at the police station just as Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez had promised, carrying court orders that left Chief Harrison with no choice but to comply. As boxes of internal affairs files were loaded into military vehicles, Harrison realized that his career in law enforcement was likely over. Officer Matthews, who had been suspended pending investigation, was watching the news coverage from his home when he saw federal marshals entering the police station. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't going to be handled with a few days of suspension and sensitivity training. The federal government was treating his actions as a serious crime, and the military was demanding justice. For one of their own. At Fort Davidson, General Hayes was coordinating with officials from multiple federal agencies. The FBI, the Justice Department, and the Pentagon were all involved now, creating a level of attention that surprised even her. What had started as a response to an attack on one of her officers had become a national story about military-civilian relations and police accountability. "General," Colonel Martinez reported during their afternoon briefing, "the Attorney General's office has confirmed that they're fast-tracking federal charges against Matthews. They're also looking at possible charges against Chief Harrison and several other supervisors for civil rights violations and obstruction of justice." General Hayes nodded with satisfaction. "Good, and what about the other officers who were present during the incident?" "Officers Reynolds and Thompson are cooperating fully with investigators. They've both admitted that Matthews's use of force was unjustified and that they should have intervened. They're likely to face departmental charges, but probably not federal prosecution." Back at the police station, the atmosphere among the civilian officers was one of fear and uncertainty. Many of them had worked with Matthews for years, and while they'd known he had issues, they'd never imagined it would lead to federal intervention. Now they were facing the possibility that their entire department could be restructured or even disbanded. Sergeant Williams, who had been working the front desk when the military police arrived, was among those called in for questioning. As she sat across from Major Chung, she realized that her 20-year career might be ending because she'd failed to speak up about Matthews's behavior. "Sergeant Williams," Major Chung said, reviewing her statement, "you've worked with Officer Matthews for 8 years. In your statement, you say you never witnessed him use excessive force or make inappropriate comments. Is that accurate?" Williams hesitated, knowing that her answer could determine her future. I never saw him physically assault anyone before the incident with Colonel Johnson. But there were times when his language was inappropriate, especially when dealing with minority suspects." "Why didn't you report these incidents to your supervisors?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Williams knew the answer. She hadn't reported Matthews because the department culture discouraged such reports, and because Chief Harrison had made it clear that he didn't want to hear complaints about his officers unless there was absolutely no choice. "I should have," Williams admitted quietly. "I know that now, but the department. We were always told to handle things internally, to give officers the benefit of the doubt." Meanwhile, at the hospital where Thomas Johnson was still recovering, a steady stream of visitors continued to arrive. Fellow officers from Fort Davidson, veterans from the community, and even some civilian police officers who wanted to apologize for their department's actions. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it also highlighted how isolated the Johnson family had felt in the immediate aftermath of the attack. Captain Jennifer Lee, who had driven over from her assignment at Fort Stewart, sat with Thomas and his family, sharing stories about their time serving together. "Colonel, what happened to you could have happened to any of us," she said. "But the way the military has responded sends a clear message. We protect our own, no matter what." Thomas nodded, still processing the magnitude of the response to his assault. "I never expected anything like this. I just wanted justice, but this has become something much bigger." "Maybe that's what was needed," his wife Rebecca said. "Maybe it took something this dramatic to make people pay attention to problems that have been ignored for too long." As evening approached, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez prepared to brief General Hayes on the day's findings. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systemic problems in the Cedar Valley Police Department that went far beyond Officer Matthews. There were patterns of racial bias, inadequate supervision, and a culture that protected problem officers at the expense of community safety. The confrontation between military and civilian authority was reaching its climax, with federal prosecutors preparing to file charges that would send a clear message about the consequences of attacking military personnel. The unprecedented military response had achieved its goal, ensuring that justice would be served, and that such attacks on uniformed service members would not be tolerated in the future. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, the military vehicles remained stationed around the police department. 6 months later, on a crisp winter morning, Officer Derek Matthews sat in a federal courthouse wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his police uniform. The man who had once wielded power with such arrogance now looked small and defeated as he listened to Judge Patricia Williams read his sentence. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including many military personnel who had come to witness justice being served for one of their own. "Mr. Matthews," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of the law, "you have been found guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law, assault on a federal officer, and civil rights violations. The court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." A collective murmur went through the courtroom. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down for police misconduct in the district, sending a clear message that attacks on military personnel would be met with the full force of federal justice. Matthews showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs, but many in the courtroom felt that justice had finally been served. Colonel Thomas Johnson sat in the front row with his wife Rebecca and daughter Lisa, watching as the man who had attacked him was finally held accountable. The past 6 months had been a journey of healing, not just for Thomas personally, but for the relationship between the military and civilian law enforcement communities. "How do you feel, Dad?" Lisa whispered as Matthews was escorted out of the courtroom. Thomas considered the question carefully. "I feel like the system worked the way it was supposed to," he said quietly. "It took longer than it should have, and it required extraordinary action, but justice was served." The investigation that had begun with Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's dramatic intervention at the Cedar Valley Police Department had ultimately led to the largest police corruption case in the region's history. Chief Harrison had resigned in disgrace and was facing his own federal charges for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. 3 other supervisors had been indicted for their roles in covering up Matthews's pattern of misconduct over the years. The Cedar Valley Police Department itself had been placed under federal oversight, with a court-appointed monitor overseeing reforms to training, hiring, and disciplinary procedures. It was a complete transformation of an institution that had protected corrupt officers for far too long. FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, who had led the federal investigation, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "This case demonstrates that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or authority," she said. "When public officials abuse their power and violate citizens' civil rights, they will be held accountable under federal law." The impact of the case had rippled far beyond Cedar Valley. Police departments across the country had implemented new policies, requiring immediate notification of military authorities when uniformed service members were involved in incidents. The Johnson Protocol, as it came to be known, ensured that attacks on military personnel would trigger automatic federal oversight and investigation. At Fort Davidson, General Hayes reflected on the unprecedented action she had authorized 6 months earlier. The decision to send military police to take over a civilian law enforcement investigation had been controversial at the time, but the results had vindicated her choice. The Pentagon had officially commended her actions, and the case had become a model for protecting military personnel from abuse of authority. "I'd make the same decision again tomorrow," General Hayes told a reporter from Military Times. "When one of our people is attacked while wearing the uniform of the United States, we have a responsibility to ensure that justice is served. The military takes care of its own, and this case proved that we mean it." Thomas Johnson had returned to full duty 3 months after the incident, but the experience had changed him in profound ways. He'd become an advocate for police reform and military-civilian relations, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the importance of mutual respect and understanding between law enforcement and the military community. His testimony before Congress about the incident had been particularly powerful, describing not just the physical assault he'd endured, but the emotional impact of being treated as a criminal while wearing the uniform he'd earned through 20 years of faithful service. "I've served my country in combat zones around the world," Thomas had told the House Judiciary Committee. "I've faced enemy fire and life-threatening situations in service to America. But nothing prepared me for being treated as a threat by the very people I've sworn to protect, simply because of the color of my skin." His words had moved many committee members to tears and had helped build bipartisan support for police reform legislation that was now making its way through Congress. The community response to the case had been overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Chun, whose cell phone video had provided crucial evidence, had been honored by the city council for her courage in documenting the incident. The elderly neighbor had become a symbol of civic responsibility and the importance of citizens standing up for what's right. "I did what anyone should do when they see injustice," Mrs. Chun said at the ceremony honoring her. "Colonel Johnson serves our country, and when someone attacked him for no reason, it was my duty to make sure the truth was known." The reforms that followed the case had improved police-community relations throughout the region. The new Cedar Valley Police Chief, Maria Rodriguez, had implemented comprehensive bias training, body camera requirements, and civilian oversight. That had begun to rebuild trust between the department and the community it served. "The actions of one officer don't define our entire profession," Chief Rodriguez said during a community meeting. "But it's our responsibility to make sure that such behavior is never tolerated again. We're committed to serving all members of our community with professionalism and respect." For the Johnson family, the months following the incident had been a time of healing and growth. Lisa had started her new job as a registered nurse, carrying with her the lessons she'd learned about standing up for justice and supporting family through difficult times. Rebecca had returned to her work as a teacher, but she'd also become involved in community groups working to improve police-community relations. The support from the military community had been overwhelming and sustained. Thomas regularly received messages from service members around the world who had been inspired by his dignity throughout the ordeal and the military's response to protect one of their own, Captain Jennifer Lee, who had visited Thomas during his recovery, had been promoted and was now serving as a training officer at Fort Davidson. She made sure that Thomas's story was included in leadership courses, teaching new officers about the importance of standing up for their people and the power of institutional support. Colonel Johnson's case changed how we think about protecting our personnel, she explained to a class of new lieutenants. "It showed that when you attack one of us, you face all of us. That's what military brotherhood means." The legal precedent set by the case had strengthened protections for all military personnel. Federal prosecutors now had clear guidelines for pursuing charges when service members were attacked while in uniform, and the enhanced penalties had served as a powerful deterrent to potential misconduct. 6 months after that terrible night, when he was tased while wearing his dress uniform, Thomas Johnson stood once again in dress blues, but this time it was for a happier occasion. He was being promoted to full colonel in a ceremony attended by his family, his fellow officers, and many of the people who had supported him throughout his ordeal. General Hayes pinned the new rank on Thomas's uniform. the same uniform that had been torn and scattered across the pavement that night in Cedar Valley. "Colonel Johnson," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "your courage and dignity in the face of injustice exemplifies the best of our military values. This promotion is well-deserved, but more importantly, your actions have made our entire institution stronger." As Thomas looked out at the assembled crowd, he saw not just his military family, but representatives from the community that had rallied around him. Mrs. Chung was there, smiling proudly. FBI agent Walsh had come to witness the ceremony. Even some reformed officers from the Cedar Valley Police Department were present, showing their support for the man they'd once failed to protect. The case had proven that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still prevail when institutions and individuals had the courage to do what was right. Officer Matthews was serving his sentence in federal prison. A corrupt police department had been reformed, and new protections were in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. Most importantly, Colonel Thomas Johnson had shown that dignity and perseverance in the face of injustice could lead to positive change that benefited everyone. His experience had been painful, but it had also demonstrated the power of standing up for what's right and the importance of institutions that protect those who serve others. The attack that had begun as one man's prejudice and abuse of power had ultimately strengthened the bonds between military and civilian communities, improved police accountability, and reaffirmed America's commitment to justice for all who serve their country with honor.